Well, all right. Let's go ahead and get started on our discussion about grief and loss. Our objectives for today's training is we want to uh, talk about some various types of losses. We want to talk about various reactions to losses, some factors influencing how loss is experienced by children, the grieving process, and how to assist children going through the grieving process. As we talk about this, commonly many of us may think about grief and loss as associated with, death, life and death, right? So the loss of a loved one. But we do want to talk about some other types of losses that ones will experience with a specific focus on children in care and those who are uh, connected with those children, i.e., their biological parents and family, as well as the caregivers who are caring for them. All right. As we discuss this topic, grief and loss can be a pretty difficult topic to talk about. As individuals, we may find ourselves reflecting on and remembering losses that we've experienced. So, feel free to take a pause to make sure that you are practicing self-care and, come back, join us as you're ready. All right. So the two main types of losses that we do want to talk about are expected losses and unexpected losses, right? And in short, just kind of if you just think about the phrasing of that, an expected loss in short would be something that just that we expect, we can, kind of anticipate, right? We have time to prep for it. Whereas an unexpected loss, on the other hand, it catches us off guard. It's a surprise to us and more of a shock. But we'll get into a little bit more about the differences between those two losses. So, expected losses, we consider them to be a part of life, right? So, considering the loss of a spouse, family, or friend, as we previously mentioned, due to normal aging, right? We all know that, we are not getting out of this thing called life alive, if you will, right? And so it's appointed to all of us to at some point pass away, and we expect to live some years though before that happens. So as we age and our body deteriorates, we're not surprised as we start to kind of in those final years. And so those, losses are a little bit easier for us to deal with. Children attending school or graduating from school. So, consider uh, your little itty bitty ones who may have been at home and eventually start to transition into daycare, and from daycare to transitioning into grade school. Maybe even some of your kids transitioning from perhaps middle school into high school in some cases can be a significant transition where one might experience loss, but more significantly, uh, after high school, right? After high school, we have our students at that age range that may not necessarily attend school near home where, they can commute from home to school. They may actually go ahead and stay on campus, and in some cases, find themselves attending schools in other states, right? And so that can be certainly a transition for our children as well as parents alike. The loss of children when they grow up and move away, right? So anybody who has adult children, maybe coming out of school or out of college, or even if they didn't go to college, they're just entering into that adulthood and, feeling that need for greater independence and just kind of having their own space. That can be quite a transition, right? You may have heard of the term being an empty nester, right? And sometimes that's a bit of a challenge for us parents to perhaps acclimate ourselves to, but just as much of a transition and challenge sometimes for our children as well. And then retirement, right? We've put in years at the job, into our careers, and we've reached that good old age of retirement where we can, sit down, maybe travel, enjoy life a little bit. But even that can be a bit of a transition, right? Because we've gotten accustomed to all of these years of waking up and having a routine, going to work and doing what was normal to us. And when that's gone, it may be a bit of a transition of, how do we manage our time day to day outside of that if perhaps we don't, have hobbies or other interests that, are, kind of taking up our time and perhaps we're not traveling as much. Uh, or the loss of a job through aging, right? So maybe I didn't plan to retire, but I had to kind of uh, forcefully retire just because my body said, nah, you can't do that anymore. I think about our athletes who, would love to have had some more years playing, but, sports, athletics, those can be pretty taxing on the body. And, if you're not taking care of yourself well, or, injuries happen as well. Things happen, life happens, and, you may have to retire prematurely. And then lastly, the physical aging process, right? As we get older, we start to experience more aches and pains, and we start to recognize and realize we can't move as fast as we once did, or, we're not able to, maybe do some of the things that we were once able to do in our younger age. And that can perhaps take a toll on the mental and um, feel like we're losing out, right? We may feel like we're losing out not being able to do those things that we remember being able to do before. Now, some expected losses are, for example, the loss of our physical health due to injury or illness, right? We are, what, maybe 3 years removed now from COVID, and that was over time we had some time to prepare for, but in the onset, that was totally unexpected for many of us, right? That we would have to deal with the complications that came with contracting COVID, right? We've dealt with the flu before and other respiratory like um, illnesses, but that and any other type of physical health injury or illness can really catch us off guard and cause us to really have to make some adjustments. And so, that can be a bit taxing on us as well. And divorce, right? I don't know too many people, if any, who get married with divorce as a plan, right? Usually the plan is we get married and we want to spend our lives loving one another. But unfortunately, sometimes things occur. People change, and come to the realization that what, it's probably best that we part ways. It's becoming unhealthy, if you will. But if you've had children involved with that process, even just having families, right? You build relationships with your new family members. All of this can be, a bit challenging, and uh, a bit much to have to deal with afterwards, right? How do I all of a sudden just kind of walk away from these other established relationships that I have? But more specifically, again, with children in the mix, children may sometimes suffer with or struggle with loyalty challenges. Uh, who do I want to be with, perhaps, when mom and dad are separated and divorced? Do I stay with mom? Do I stay with dad? All right. The death of a parent at an early age, right? So, we have time to prepare for our parents dying as they get older, because we can see that deterioration over time, perhaps. But when they die prematurely, perhaps from an accident or something like that, um, that definitely is unexpected. And, for some, depending on our resiliency and our ability to process loss, can be a bit challenging for us. The loss of a job, right? So, being laid off, uh, thinking back on COVID all over again, right? During COVID, we had to experience a shutdown, and plenty of people, we had to deal with the phrase of being an essential worker, right? And so during COVID, a lot of people, uh, sadly, unfortunately, found out that, quote unquote, their job or the work that they did wasn't considered essential. And as a result, a lot of companies shut down, businesses closed up, and people in the process lost their jobs, and had to some come back and acquire new skills, learn new skills, and enter into new fields because certain fields just were no longer viable when they came back to the workforce. Infertility, those who desire to have children but cannot, right? Um, you can plan and be excited about having children, and that can be a bit of a gut punch to find out that either you or your partner is unable to reproduce, unable to um, be able to have children. And so then you have to look into other options, perhaps adoption. And even that can be a challenge because, some people have a strong desire to have their own biological children and may not be as open to adoption. And so you have to contend with and navigate that space and what your next steps might be. And then the loss of possessions due to accidents or disasters. We're kind of in the midst of hurricane season. And so, down in the southern, southeastern parts of the United States, we're seeing, a lot of hurricanes coming up and, storms that are drumming up and causing a lot of damage, and people are losing their homes, losing their possessions, being displaced, moved to different areas because of that damage. And yes, in many instances, individuals may have insurances in place to help to recoup and bounce back from some of those losses, but uh, that doesn't, replace everything. Sometimes we're losing sentimental uh, objects and memories that are the result of that loss because once you build back, it may not feel the same. Now, how do we react to uh, various types of losses, right? So let's do a comparison between our expected and unexpected losses. So with expected losses, they're shared by all, right? um, versus unexpected losses where they may be shared by all but are not necessarily shared equally by all. Um, as we talked about those, expected losses like the loss of a spouse through aging, we all, can wrap our mind around that and can prepare for those things. But the loss of a loved one at an unexpected time, um, those don't necessarily hit us all the same. Everyone doesn't respond to those the same. And then with our unexpected loss, as a result of that, of them being shared by all, we usually have greater supports available to us as opposed to with our unexpected losses, where we may feel that there's less support available to us. Um, Again, a lot of this is due to the fact that we don't have that same opportunity to prepare for unexpected losses as we do for our expected losses, right? Because they're expected, we also view loss and grieving as normal, right? Whereas our unexpected losses that grieving process, that loss is not regarded as normal, right? Because it's not normal to wake up one day and, all of a sudden realize that I've lost someone to an accident or to a storm, right? We're talking about the hurricanes. Uh, think back to 9/11, right? People didn't wake up on 9/11 thinking that uh, or anticipating that those events would occur and so many lives would be lost as a result of it. Uh, with our unexpected loss, there's no great sense of blame or shame, again, because they're anticipated, they're shared by all. No one is inclined to feel compelled to point the finger at one another. Versus our unexpected losses, we may process those and think to ourselves, oh man, I could have done this or I could have done that. Or had I done this or had I done that, maybe this wouldn't have happened, right? Just thinking about the example of divorce as an unexpected loss, for example, it's very easy at times to look at that relationship after the fact and begin to realize and process the things that you may have been able to do differently that could have saved the marriage, right? And then lastly, um, with our expected losses, we are generally better prepared to cope with those, right? Because we have time. Time is an advantage that we have to prepare for those losses versus our unexpected losses that are more sudden. Um, we don't have that same opportunity to prepare for them. Um, and so our ability to cope may be a little bit more challenging in those moments. So let's start to look at this relationship between children, parents, and families, and the various types of losses that they may experience when we look at this through the lens of, perhaps foster care, adoption, and so forth. Right. And so when we look at our birth families and consider the losses that they might experience, one of the losses is simply the loss of their child or children, right? My child was in my home with me, and now they're not. They're being displaced and, being placed with perhaps a loved one or someone that they may be familiar with, or being placed in a home with a total stranger to them, right? A stranger to me. The loss of a home, right? So sometimes, birth parents, in addition to losing their child, they may be losing their home as well, right? So they may have to contend with homelessness, maybe being in a shelter or some other temporary housing. And then there's the loss of physical or mental health. Uh, the loss of physical health can be taxing on the mind, right? I think back to when I had gone on a men's trip, and in doing so, we're fellowshipping and we're playing basketball, and I end up injuring my knee. And thankfully, it wasn't, uh, an injury that required any kind of surgery or anything like that. But for the rest of the trip, it was pretty difficult for me to get around. We're out in the mountains, we're not really nearby anything. Thankfully, I didn't have to necessarily go to the ER or anything, but I definitely had to spend the rest of that trip really staying off of my feet, kind of keeping my leg elevated and things of that nature. And then when we got back to our destination, I had to figure out how I was going to get home because now I have to drive. Thankfully, it wasn't the leg that I use predominantly to drive, but I had to navigate that space, kind of go and figure out next steps in regards to treatment, get a brace, get, something like a cane or something to help me with assisting with that. But mentally, I had to navigate all of that space and begin to think about, okay, well, now how much time am I going to miss with work? How is that going to impact my finances and things of that nature? So, um, the loss of our physical and mental health can be um, pretty challenging in the midst of us having to navigate all of these other things. So that's something to consider for our birth families, as another loss that they might experience when they are losing their child and perhaps a home. The loss of a spouse or significant other, it's unfortunate, but not uncommon, sometimes for placements to be the result of domestic violence, right? And so here I am one day with someone that I love and care about, someone that I think loves and cares about me. But because of the nature of our circumstances, we have to separate. We have to, we can no longer uh, reside in the same space because of the uh, concerns regarding danger, right? And so that could be a temporary thing, but I also may have to contend with that and look at that as the possibility of a uh, permanent, long-term change, right? Um, or maybe it wasn't domestic violence. Maybe I literally just lost a loved one due to an unexpected death. And depending on, the dynamics within our family, if that person was the breadwinner bringing in most of the finances for our family, that could put a strain and make it difficult for me to, care for my family, for my children, resulting in some of these changes, these other changes that I now have to experience. And then the loss of self-esteem. Just consider, having to embrace the fact that, others might view you as being unable to care for your children. I don't think that that's a feeling anybody wants to experience. Nobody wants to uh, feel like they're inadequate or unable, especially to take care of their children. And so, if you are feeling that way when you lose your child and they're placed in care, that loss of self-esteem can be a pretty normal loss to experience. And then lastly, the loss of control, right? I effectively now have to co-parent, right? Even if I was a single parent before, I'm now co-parenting with the parent that my child is now placed with, right? And so I have to coordinate and work with them to make sure that uh, my child is taken care of and making sure that we are collectively doing things in the best interest of my child. Resource families. What are some experiences that they may lose, some losses that they may experience rather? Well, first, the loss of the family constellation, right? So think about kinship. I go now from being perhaps an uncle or an aunt to now, operating and functioning in the role of father, mother, parent, caregiver, right? As an aunt and uncle, grandparent, I was accustomed to having my niece, nephew, grandchild come over probably for a defined period of time. We have fun, and I send you back home to your parent. But now, with this transition, you're with me full time. Those dynamics may change things. The loss of their own children, right? And more specifically, when you think about the loss of their own children, if we will, when we think about our resource families, it's really kind of thinking about the change or shift in the dynamics of the relationship, right? Somewhat similar, not quite the same, but you think about a child in your family when a newborn comes on to the scene, right? That child, that older sibling has to process and contend with not having as much of mom and dad's attention as they once had. And so likewise, a child that, your biological child as a resource parent likewise may find themselves contending with that similar contention or disruption of, man, mom and dad now has to dedicate their time and attention to another person. Resource parents may also experience the loss of status in the community. When I think about this, I don't know if you are all familiar with it, but the movie, what was it? The Blind Side, right? The Blind Side with Sandra Bullock. I think that movie depicts a little bit of the life of football player Michael Orr. And in this film, Sandra Bullock, her and her husband are, a family that is well off, and their children attend the same school as Michael Orr. And they happen to one day notice that, he seems to be a little disheveled, be displaced, and, they're a bit concerned. So, they reach out, they take him in for the night, and eventually this kind of turns into them fostering him, and then eventually adopting him. But there's a scene in that film where Sandra is out to like brunch or something like that with some of her friends, and she's sharing with them this story and this process that she's going through with Michael, and the comments and responses that she gets from her friends are really judgmental, and they're kind of looking down at her and kind of questioning her decision to do that. And thankfully she kind of shrugs that off and is determined to make sure that Michael has what he needs and eventually is really just a part of the family. Uh, but that's an example of not everybody has that same attitude that you may have about caring for a child that's not biologically theirs. And so that can be somewhat challenging to deal with. The loss of privacy, right? As a part of foster care, you've got to go through that process of being opened up, getting all kind of clearances and background checks. And so that's not, outside of maybe doing those types of things for a job, those are not things that you may have, thought about having to do. But now that you are embarking in the process of foster care, adoption, what have you, you now have to go through some of those same checks and balances. And then additionally, having to also deal with regular visits where, people are checking in and, ensuring the safety and care of the child that's been placed with you. And so for some people, that can be a bit taxing. For others, they may easily embrace it. But nonetheless, it is a change that requires some level of coping and adjustments, possibly. Loss of autonomy in parenting, right? If you have your own children, you've been accustomed to, for the most part, making many, if not all, of your decisions independently, or perhaps with a spouse or partner. But in this case, you're now having to communicate and coordinate some of these decisions with the parent, with the agency. And let's face it, that can sometimes slow things down, and can be a bit frustrating, especially in instances where time is of the essence and you feel like time is limited. The loss of foster children, right? So, specifically for foster care, the child's placed with you for a specific period of time, right? With the ultimate goal of being reunified with their parent. And in some instances, that child, that family may elect to cut off or, minimize communications once that child has been removed from the home. Um, you think about kinship, that can be that much more challenging, a little bit more difficult to do because you're my family or someone that I'm already familiar with. But even still, as a biological parent, being reunified with my child, I may have a greater motivation to really want to um, monopolize a little bit more of that time now that I have my child back. And so I may not be as open as I once was to outside voices or to maintaining that relationship. Now, that's not always the case. In some instances, you may have children and families that maintain that relationship and instead realize that, what, my child's foster parents, foster family, uh, can serve as extended family, an additional resource, and perhaps, you know, uh, really make me, or help me rather, uh, solidify this reunification process that much more. And then lastly, the loss of freedom as a resource family. Um, Having someone else in my care, having different regulations and different uh, uh, entities and whatnot kind of governing how I care for this child could impact plans that I have for my own family, right? There may be instances where I legitimately have to consider um, options where perhaps I'm leaving a child temporarily in the care of someone else when me and my family needs to travel. But then I have to contend with how that child might feel um, when we get back and when they are brought back into the home. All right, let's talk about some losses experienced by children. All right, so a few losses that a child may experience during the process of being in placement is simply separation from their parent, first and foremost. Right, so I am moving from being physically uh, with my parents to now being displaced and physically with someone else that is caring for me. And I now have to navigate that space of, going through visitations and things of that nature. Separation from extended family and other important people, right? These are people that I may not necessarily uh, be able to see as frequently as I may have been accustomed to seeing them. I might not necessarily see them during visitations because that's, not necessarily the priority, if you will. My parent may work to have them join me with visits or join at visits, but if I'm not in the local community, I don't have that same level of access. I may be limited to phone calls with them. Whereas prior to, perhaps I was accustomed to going and spending time with cousins and uncles and grandparents and whatnot on the weekends. Separation from school, church, friends, greater community. Thankfully, a lot is done in the child welfare space to try to minimize this by placing children in kinship, with people with family members or other members of the community that they are familiar with. That often can help to minimize this separation from school, church, friends, and greater community. But that is, at times an additional separation that a child may experience. And then lastly, separation from culture. Culture is a pretty comprehensive thing, right? There's a lot to unpack when we think about culture. And so it's important for us to recognize that the culture that a child has experienced in their home may very well be different from the culture that they are now experiencing in your home. And so, we may have to educate ourselves on a little bit about their culture, perhaps to gain an understanding if and where we can accommodate them to, integrate some of their culture maybe into our home so that they are able to feel more at home and not feel like they're losing that culture that they are coming from or a part of. And so as we think about these losses that a child experiences, one of our basic components as resource parents is to help children deal with their losses. And so let's talk a little bit about that, right? Before we do that, though, we also need to consider some of the influences that factor in and impact how a child is experiencing said loss, right? So, one, the nature of the loss, right? So, how a child is processing and experiencing the loss of or separation from their parent is going to be different than how they're processing their loss or separation from extended family members, their community, or their culture, right? The age at the time of loss, right? So, if you think about just being a child and just how we develop over time, when we were little, let's say kindergarten, preschool, early, first maybe up to about second or third grade. If you and I had a conflict with a classmate, a peer, a friend, we would have that conflict, and 5 minutes later, we could be back to being best friends again as if nothing ever happened. And it's forgotten almost, right? Whereas as we get older, we go later into our school years, transition into middle school, high school, adulthood. This thing called memory sinks in. And the older we get, the more inclined we may be to hold grudges, right? And so those memories interfere with us being able to bounce back as quickly as we might have once done. Likewise, if you think about children in those earlier stages of life, and there's other factors that impact this as well, be it attachment and things of that nature. But, some younger children experience losses, go through accidents and things of that nature. And it's almost, when you look at them, it seems as if they went through that whole experience and encounter unscathed. There may appear to be no evidence that, a loss has occurred. Whereas the older we get, we may see a little bit more evidence of that because we have these things called memories that are impacting how we process that experience, right? Our ability to understand why. All right, so depending again on the nature of the loss, my ability to understand why in some instances may help me to process that loss a little easier, whereas my inability to understand why may exacerbate it and make it more difficult for me to process that loss. All right. The amount of emotional strength. One of the things that kind of comes to my mind here is I think back on just my own personal experiences where, specifically dealing with the loss of loved ones due to death. When it comes to dealing with death, when I look at myself as it relates to the rest of my family, there are times where my actions may give the appearance to others that I'm emotionally strong, because I'm not expressing my grief the way that others are expressing it. And therefore, I'm viewed as having the capacity to be a support, to be a shoulder to cry on, if you will. And, I can clearly recall experiences in my childhood, adolescence, and what have you, where I got it. I understood why they thought that I might have been emotionally strong. But deep down on the inside, I knew, hey, I've got just enough emotional strength right now to be keeping myself together. I don't necessarily have it in me to be there to encourage or support anyone else at this moment, at this time, even though it looks like I can. Cultural influences, right? Different cultures experience loss differently. Just thinking about the foster care process, different cultures have different perspectives on foster care. Some cultures may view uh, the situation and question why a child or loved one wasn't placed with a family member before it got to the point where they had to be removed from the home. And therefore, they may have some reservations around how much they engage and interact with the foster care process. uh, Circumstances causing the loss, right? So, um, for example, you think about, unfortunately, individuals, children who end up in care because of a parent who is battling drug addiction. Um, those those types of causes for a child being in care, uh, is something additional that that child has to contend with, right? They uh, may have a strong desire to be back with their parent, may even have a desire to care for their parent because of the challenges that they see that their parent is facing. Even a parent who is, perhaps battling with health and mental health complications that are disrupting their ability to care for their child. Again, that child may, depending on their age, have a desire to want to actually um, really kind of be or take on like a parentified uh, mindset, wanting to care for their parent, right? Wanting to nurture. And then the number of previous losses, right? So, uh, how many losses like this or other types of losses uh, has this child experienced, right? In some instances, um, a greater number of losses may give that child an opportunity and a greater capacity to bounce back and demonstrate greater resilience. Uh, but it just as well um, could take a toll on that child and make it more difficult for them to process loss and navigate through that space. So let's talk a little bit about the different responses that children, or really anyone for that matter, may experience or demonstrate or display as they go through the grieving process. So first and foremost, we may observe individuals displaying shock, denial, or protest. Some may engage in bargaining. Others may engage in anger, acting out, or depression. And then ultimately, hopefully our goal is to get to a place where we are at least responding from a place of understanding, and ideally coping is our ultimate goal when it comes to our response to loss in the grieving process. So let's talk a little bit about what each of those are and how we can support someone experiencing those things. So a child experiencing shock, denial, and protest, we may observe them looking for their parent in the new home. We may find that they continually ask to go home. All right. We may observe that they're having eating or sleeping problems. And let's face it, if I'm having eating and sleeping problems, uh, my diet and my ability to get rest can ultimately, over time, take a toll on my body, which could result in me experiencing more injuries or developing illnesses. Okay. Um, Giving little or no evidence of being upset at all. Right. Doesn't mean that they're not upset, but that lack of evidence or me being able to easily observe them being upset or bothered by this loss is sometimes an indicator that the child is in shock, denial, or protest. And if you think about it, um, we can kind of liken that to or observe that when, somebody's in an unexpected accident, right? You're in a car accident and it's pretty substantial. It's a shocker. You may have that period in time where you are in shock and in denial that it has even happened. and it may take some time for that to sink in before you're actually able to kind of move and progress through the grieving process, or move towards another step of navigating through that loss. The child may turn to fantasy world, right? Now that can be somewhat challenging to observe, especially in our younger kids, your toddlers, um, and maybe up to about 5 years old, maybe even a little older in some instances. But our younger children, they may already just naturally be in fantasy world. So for them, it might be a little bit challenging or more difficult for us to observe than we might if we saw a preteen or teen or adolescent engaging in fantasy world. That might be a little bit more obvious to us. Uh, Lastly, a child may be find themselves being eager to please and show compliant behaviors, right? To keep the peace, to maybe make it feel easier for them to transition. Um, but that's just their way of processing. So, how do we help a child who is experiencing shock denial and protest? Well, first, um, one, it's important for us to recognize that the absence of outward expression of feelings does not mean that there are no feelings there at all, right? We want to provide the child with information about their situation, and when we do that, we also want to do that, as appropriate. So we may uh, coordinate and kind of, maybe work with our team to uh, determine what's appropriate to be shared, especially depending on the age of the child. Ensure comfortability, right? So we want to ensure that the child is comfortable and in a comforting environment, and this goes hand in hand with reassuring the child that they're safe, right? One of the ways that we can help them or reassure them that they're safe is by creating a comfortable and comforting environment. One of the ways that we can do that is by incorporating them and including them uh, in the process of setting up their sleeping space, right? So their room, that is that could be a primary safe space for that child. And so it might not be suitable for me to go in there and just establish and set up everything. I might want to leave some things for them to maybe rearrange or set up, so that they are perhaps incorporating some of their culture within their room and within that space, right? Because maybe they don't feel that in other parts of the house, but they can at least feel that there. And then lastly, we want to provide close supervision, right? So keeping a close eye, really being observant of the behaviors and the actions that we're seeing, so that we, one, can place them within an appropriate context, and two, figure out what may be needed to support that child as they go through this process. Behaviors or feelings of children who are engaging in bargaining. We may find children who are bargaining, having conversations with themselves, right? Or even imaginary conversations with family members, right? Trying to maintain, some sort of connection with those individuals that they are physically displaced from. We may find them using inappropriate behavior to get kicked out, and doing so with the hopes that they're sent back to their family. And so we may need to work with them and help them to understand that doing so is not going to uh, get them back to their parents any sooner, or back to their family any sooner. And in some instances, we may need to help them understand some of the other adverse effects of engaging in said inappropriate behavior, and how that can reflect upon them, and maybe result in disruptions and them being placed in other homes. And that's not the desire. We're not trying to, we don't want them to feel like we're trying to get rid of them. But instead, we really want to demonstrate and create an environment where they recognize that, you know, we are all in this together, that we are with them, that we are with their parents, and then, hopefully they're able to see that relationship grow, build, see that effective co-parenting where they see their parent working alongside you as a foster parent, to care for them. They may try to be perfect or make every situation perfect. I don't know, everybody has a different personality, but me myself definitely contend sometimes with uh, pursuing perfection, right? But I have to constantly remind myself that while it's okay to pursue perfection, by no means am I always going to be perfect. It's impossible, right? Mistakes are inevitable, right? And so those mistakes are going to prevent me from being quote unquote perfect. And I need to understand, embrace that, and recognize that even in the midst of those mistakes, they are actually supporting me in my pursuit of perfection if I embrace them and learn from them, right? Uh, Feelings of guilt and self blame. So you think about a child who is dealing with truancy issues. If I have been truant and racking up all kinds of absences and missing school, eventually, that kind of triggers the school identifying that, reaching out to the parent. And if my parent is not as easy to get to or not as responsive, it very well may eventually result in me being pulled from the home due to truancy issues. And now that I'm being displaced, I may reflect back on that and feel like I'm the one to blame, that I'm responsible for that. And while that may be partially true, where I, yes, made the decisions to not go to class, not go to school, um, it's also up to those adults in the situation, be it the school and the parent, to maintain effective communication to minimize and reduce those instances where I'm able to get away with that and there's no accountability, if you will. And let's face it, sometimes that is difficult, especially if I'm dealing with a parent who's in a single home and perhaps holding down two jobs. They, for what many may say is good reason, uh, find it difficult to be as responsive to emails, phone calls, and things of that nature that are coming through. And so it's not to say that they are, you know, don't care about their child excelling, performing well at school, and being present. They're just preoccupied with perhaps trying to financially provide for their family. And so, it's important for us to recognize that this is a holistic thing. And in that particular situation or scenario that that I've given, with truancy being the cause for placement, uh, or I have to help that child understand that, yeah, this is not all on you. This is you ought not be blaming yourself. Everybody um, had a part to play in this, and it very well may take everybody collectively getting this back on track. And additionally, there may be other things as well that are contributing to it, that child may not even know about. um, as we assist children or help children who are bargaining, we want to provide them with an opportunity to talk and express their feelings about their families. Give them permission to express sad, guilty, blaming, and angry feelings, right? Understanding that feelings are just that. They're feelings. We all have them. We're all entitled to them. It's what we do with those feelings where we run into problems potentially, right? So have the feeling, but once we identify those feelings, let's work on navigating how we're going to manage those feelings. All right, gently help the child to understand, or children, to understand that whether or not they go home or when they return home is not it's primarily, dependent upon their family's behavior and not theirs, right? We want to provide consistent and supportive reminders that they are safe in our home and they're not going to be asked to leave, right? And then lastly, we want to give factual and not judgmental information about what happened and the reason for the placement. And so this is, kind of goes back to, again, that conversation that I was talking about with uh, substance abuse, right? We in time in this history in the United States have transitioned from a point in time where substance abuse was not viewed through the lens of a medical or health crisis. It was more criminal. It was more uh, viewed as a choice, right? Now, sadly, unfortunately, there are still people who hold to that opinion and, may be challenged in seeing it as a health crisis. And, quite frankly, I'm of the mindset that it's a little bit of both, right? There's a health component of it where, that addiction can take control and influence and impact your judgment. But along that process, we still have to make choices. And we may need support and help to make better choices along the way so that we can work against that addiction. And so, if we're not careful, if I'm not careful as a parent, I could inflect or insert my own personal opinions, and find myself giving more judgmental information as opposed to factual information, which can create all kinds of challenges. If you think about it, if I am being judgmental about the child's parent, they might not take too kindly to that, right? It may very well begin to cause some tension between me and that child, because depending on their level of attachment to their parent, they may immediately go to the defense of that parent. And now they're viewing me as an opposition. And we really want to work towards a place where we are allies one to another, right? We are allies with that child, allies with the agency, allies with that parent, and vice versa, right? We want that child to recognize and be an ally, right? So help me help you, rather, right? Likewise with the parent. I'm not here to replace you. We are here together collectively to work towards caring for your child, and we're working towards getting them back home with you. Okay. How do we help children who are dealing with anger, where they may act out or contend with depression? Well, we want to give them permission to feel angry. We want to help that child to express their anger in a non-harmful way or non-harmful ways. We want to teach good behavior management strategies, right? So again, this kind of goes back even to our discussion with the whole shock denial protest piece, right? You're going to have the feelings. Feelings are a natural part of being human, right? But what do I do when I have those feelings? How do I behave when I have those feelings? I want to behave in a way that's going to be constructive and not destructive, right? Not destructive to me, not destructive to anyone around me, right? And so maybe I don't know how to handle those things. I may need some encouragement, some support, some guidance, some examples of what I can do differently to better manage my behavior as a response to what I'm feeling. We want to give the child daily, consistent, structured support in managing their anger and feelings, right? For example, if I know that, I am containing with a child who seems to be coming home from school, and, there could be a variety of reasons of why they may be coming home from school with an attitude, or, kind of being overcome or overwhelmed with their emotions. One example could be is that, I have siblings that unfortunately weren't placed with me in the home that I'm in, but we all still go to the same school. And so I'm seeing, my sibling at school, and perhaps they're telling me about, we're recalling our day, and they're telling me, about their experiences in their home that they're in. And that's challenging for me, especially if I want to be, if I feel like there's something that I could do or think that I can do to comfort them or make that a better experience for them. But I'm not there. And so I'm not fit because I'm not physically there. I may now come home and I'm now struggling with my emotions, and specifically contending with the feeling of being helpless, right? Not being able to help my sibling. And depending on where I'm at with my relationship with you, I may not be quite ready to open up and share that, right? And so, as a parent, part of me getting you to that place is, one, ensuring that you feel safe, right? And feeling that you have an environment where you feel comfortable sharing that information with me. But from the lens of establishing a structured environment and support, part of that may come to me in that example that I just gave, finding out that that's the case. And maybe that's happening because, surprisingly, this child is actually having access to their sibling that is not necessarily structured, right? Because if you're in school, you're in your class. Usually different grades are not, depending on the size of the school, in immediate proximity with one another. Different grades certainly generally have different lunch times and whatnot. And so there are plenty of instances where children, depending on their, the gaps in their grades, may never interact with each other at school outside of the end of the day and the beginning of the day. But what I've come to find out in this particular example is, this child is during certain classes having a greater frequency where they're asking to do something outside of the room, be it go to the bathroom or whatever, what have you. And they're now going ahead and they know where their sibling is in the school, and they're going, kind of hanging out side of their classroom, and perhaps kind of convincing them to get out of class too. And they're now having conversations and stuff that they might not have otherwise had. So structure can be really important throughout the course of a day. And again, that may be not only me establishing structure at home, but also working with others who are caring for the child, others who are interacting with the child, maintaining structure in those environments as well. Helping the child dealing with anger or depression, right? We want to give them, again, always permission for that child to feel sad, and reassurance that over time those feelings will be better, right? We want to provide them with time to be left alone. I don't know about you, but I certainly have my moments where, I need my fair share of alone time, right? As some may call it, my social battery may be a little bit low, right? And I got to get recharged. And so, likewise, our children, everybody at times needs that time to be left alone. Now, we do want to be cautioned with that, where someone who's already having excessive time alone Yes, you may still have your fair share of alone time, but I might want to be watchful of that, right? Are you really desiring to be alone all the time? And if so, I might have to start to ask myself why, right? I may need to investigate that a little bit more or explore that a little bit more. Provide close, structured supervision to ensure safety. We want to provide encouragement and praise for even small accomplishments. Um, we live in a day and age where everybody is out kind of pointing out the flaws that others have. And so it's easy for us to pinpoint areas of opportunity or growth. Um, but it's just as important, if not more important, for us to likewise um, find those things that we can encourage and praise one another for. Because I don't know about you, but I can certainly, say for myself, encouragement and praise goes a long way to building self-esteem and self-confidence, which can carry over into uh, other areas of our life and have profound and positive impacts in those other areas. And then conversely, if I'm not receiving that encouragement, not receiving that praise, I could perhaps become overly critical, and contend with low self-esteem, and find myself having more difficulty overcoming challenges in my life. We want to provide comfort, reassurance of safety, and a sense of hopefulness, right? We don't want that opposite to occur where the person is feeling hopeless, right? And then lastly, providing availability and nurturing to the child without pushing the child to talk. Uh, what's the phrase? Practice makes perfect. Well, I think that that's an appropriate phrase for this particular point here, right? Because I'm trying to find that healthy balance where I am cultivating conversation and encouraging conversation, um, yet not being too intrusive. So it really requires me to be observant, right? Being able to pick up on nonverbals, those nonverbal cues, the body language that is making it clear and evident that, okay, uh, I think we've reached a point where this child, has shared all that they care to share or want to share at this moment, and we'll pull it back a little bit, give them a little bit more time uh, before we extend the conversation. All right. Helping our children, additionally, that are dealing with anger or depression, we want to provide them with an opportunity to cling, right? While also providing reassurance for independent actions, right? This can be kind of challenging when we, tack on the different personality types. Just kind of thinking about the two phrases that we have here, independent and clinging. you know uh, we may have a child who naturally clings or naturally kind of is quick to attach, right? And so how do I manage that conversely to a child that is more independent and detached, right? Those are two different temperaments. And so, I want to take those temperaments, personality types into context while I'm doing this and working towards finding that balance, right? Because uh, that person that is clinging, or that person who is at least in the moment clinging, if I'm not aware of that, I could very well uh, find myself responding in a way where I call myself giving them independence, when in actuality, in that moment, they need to cling. And if I don't handle that right, they may find themselves feeling rejected, right? Whereas the opposite, they're coming to me and desiring and demonstrating or displaying a desire for independence, and I'm responding and acting as if they're trying to cling. Well, in that instance, I might come across as overbearing or being intrusive, right? So I have to be aware again of some of these nonverbals that may exist that are helping me to kind of differentiate when the child is looking to cling versus when they're looking to have that independence and being sure that I'm giving the right response based on what is needed in that moment. I want to provide reassurance that the child is valuable, important, and lovable. Depending on the natures of the circumstances of that loss and that child being displaced from their home, uh, they may battle with some of those feelings. They may feel at times like they're not valued or important or loved, um, simply because they're not in the home with their parent, right? And that could be so far from the truth in many instances, right? Yet again, God forbid that their parent is missing scheduled visits. It could further intensify that feeling of not being valuable, important, or lovable. And so I want to work with them and reassure them that that's not the case. And at times, depending on the age, I may have to help them understand that uh, in short, life happens, right? And so with that, circumstances, things come up, things happen that disrupt our plans, really, right? And then lastly, we want to openly support the child's relationship with their birth parents and siblings, right? So again, just looking back at that whole visitation piece, hey, maybe I see that we're, struggling to uh, effectively maintain consistent visits or and whatnot. And maybe I need to really transition and consider having more phone calls, more, especially in this day and age with technology being what it is, more virtual calls where, maybe perhaps we're not physically in place, but, we're virtually connecting with that parent for them to maintain and support that relationship. Um, Additionally, as we help children contending with anger and depression, we want to connect the child with counseling and therapy if needed and as needed, right? We want to collaborate with mental health professionals, especially if the child appears suicidal or remains extremely withdrawn, so that we're keeping a close eye on that. And then collaborating with substance abuse professionals if there are concerns that the child is, in fact, abusing substances. Okay. Uh, and then lastly, some signs of understanding and coping, as those are, again, our goals to pursue when we are responding to loss. Children who are in a place of understanding and coping with a loss will express more hope for, their future and the future of that situation. They are typically going to be more successful in learning and managing their behaviors and feelings. And then they're also going to be more apt to learn new behaviors as they begin to cope. Okay. And so when we think about this, the help that is given to, during, and after a loss may be extremely key to helping a child or children grieve, right? So we want to be looking at that, right? What kind of help or supports did that child have prior to the loss, during the loss, and after the loss? um, just a couple of things to kind of throw and add into there. When we consider foster care, there's a lot of prevention type services that are available. One, for example, is a crisis program called Calm within the Philadelphia area that is specifically focused on children in placement, both being initially placed as well as being moved from one foster home to another. um, and the goal is for them to connect with that child and that family, to assist and support that transition, right? And then there's other services that are available if it's determined that that child and family may need something a little bit more long term, to support them and to work towards stability. All right. Calm, focus more on that initial placement and initial disruption for a shorter period of time. They may make referrals if there are not other services already established and in place to support that child and or family.